All right, everyone can hear me? All good? All right, so my talk is abusing password reuse at scale, Bcrypt and beyond. You probably don't know me as Sam if you know me at all. You probably know me as Chicken Man, but we'll get to that. So, in this talk, I'm going to be assuming you have some password cracking knowledge. I'm assuming you have cracked a hash at some point, or thought about it, or done any amount of research that I can say things and not have to explain every single word I say. But I will cover some simple stuff. I'll gloss kind of over it a little bit fast, but I'll go through it. We'll be talking about mega breaches, the news's favorite new term, and database dumps and stolen hashes, things like that. We'll be talking about the concept of password herd immunity in salted hash lists, and then efficiently reducing that herd immunity. That would be the attack. I'll be doing a demo of the attack itself, and then talking about what can be done in the future to improve the attack, and then questions. So first, a little bit about me. Again, I am Chicken Man to almost anyone who knows me. I currently work at TeraHash, formerly known as Sagita HPC. You probably know them for their Brutalis, their cracking machines. I'm a password enthusiast. I'm a hash cracker. I'm part of Team Hashcat. It basically consumes my life. And I'm a part-time chicken enthusiast, so chickens. So yeah, so let's go over some of the basics real quick. What is a hash? You should know this by now, but just in case you don't, password hashes are the way of storing passwords in a database so you don't have plaintext passwords. Hash functions are one-way deterministic trapdoor functions. For every input, you have a single output, and with that output, you shouldn't be able to know the input backwards. You shouldn't be able to know it without having it first. Never, ever store passwords in plain text if you can help it, please. Always hash your passwords. This thing is annoying. Okay, so how do we crack passwords? Because password hashes are one way, you can't go backward, you can't decrypt like encryption. So the best way to figure out what the password was is to generate tons and tons and tons and tons of hashes until you get the same hash, in which case you either have a collision or you have the correct input password. The tools we use to do this, the free tools are Hashcat, John the Ripper, MDXFind, Hash Manager, Inside Pro. There's a bunch of free tools, and then there's commercial tools like HashStack. I believe Password has tools, Access Data, several other companies have commercial software for this. The hardware we typically use is mostly GPUs, although some algorithms, as you'll see in a moment, are better on CPU. There are FPGAs and ASICs and other fancy specialized hardware that can generate hashes very quickly, but those are typically pretty rare. You've probably heard of Bitcoin ASICs. They do SHA-256 times 2, I believe it's 2 rounds of SHA-256. And they do it very quickly, but they're not useful for breaking SHA-256 hashes. They can only do that one type of math. The attack methodologies that you should probably be familiar with would be brute force or mask attacks, where you start with, A, and then A, B, and so on and so forth. Those are usually very inefficient. The key space is very large. They're not very good for complicated passwords or long passwords, things where there's lots of symbols, things like that do not fall easily to brute force. Dictionary and rules is probably the most used attack, I would say, past brute force. With a dictionary, you take known passwords, English words, things like that, and you run those against the list. And then with rules, because you're unlikely to have every modification of every password in your list, rules allow you to modify each candidate by adding a number, replacing A with an @ symbol, S with 5s, doing very basic stuff like that to try and mimic human behavior and how people create stronger passwords. Stronger these days tends to be longer, not necessarily more complex, because most of those patterns are very predictable. People add 1s and 0s to the ends of passwords all the time. And there are other attack methods, combinator, hybrid, prints. I'm sure there's more that I'm missing, but most of those tend to be kind of on the edge. I know a lot of people spend a lot of time on them. I tend not to, so I'm kind of just going to gloss over those. So how do we make hashes stronger against this cracking? The first methodology would be salting, where you take a random, usually unique to each hash string, and you append it, or you prepend it, or you add it somehow to the input plaintext, so that two identical plaintext generate two unique hashes. This solves the problem of rainbow tables, but this does not solve on-the-fly cracking of just a few hashes. It does create a higher workload, as we'll see in the talk, but it's not really suggested anymore. Everything should be salted, but that's not all you need. We have iterations. If you take a hash and you hash it again a couple times, you can create, 1,000 MD5 hashes layered over each other is 1,000 times harder to crack in theory. Although that being said, if it's a fast hash, 1,000 may not be, very much. You could be up in the trillions of hashes per second on your system, and 1,000 is not going to be noticeable. So iterations are good. They're just, again, not really what you need to be focused on anymore. These days, the suggested hashing algorithms would be slow hashes. Bcrypt, Scrypt, Argon 2, I, and D, I believe. The slow hashes are not just high iteration and not just salted, but typically they are memory hard, which means because password cracking is a parallel operation, if you have an algorithm that requires a certainly large amount of memory, you can't start that many threads. Your device will fall to local mem size, and you'll be limited, even if you're not consuming the whole processor, to how many things you can do at once. And so that makes it much harder to run these algorithms. And plus, they are very high iteration. Bcrypt, the iteration, the cost value is actually 2 to that number of rounds. So if you have 8 cost Bcrypt, as you'll see later, that's 2 to the 8 number of rounds. A lot of rounds. So it makes it a lot harder to run these hashes, and you'll see that they're much slower. All right, so let's talk about mega breaches and database dumps. The news went crazy about mega breaches sort of recently, but they've been around for a while. A lot of the popular ones were dumped in 2011, 2012, 2013, and only came to light really in the past 2 or 3 years. So they've been out there for a while, if you know where to look. MySpace was a very popular one. It was one of the largest for a long time. It's still one of the larger ones. There was 360 million accounts that got dumped. And that was accounts with passwords. Now, they hashed their passwords with SHA-1, but they made some mistakes. The passwords that they were hashing were truncated and forced to lowercase. So we were able to complete the key space on the 10-character passwords in, a couple weeks. No big deal. There were other passwords in there that were full passwords. Some account lines had a truncated hash and a second hash that had the full password as well, which you could just take the first hash and take that password and basically truncate off the first 10 characters of the second hash. LinkedIn was a very popular one, got very famous because small portions of it came out right as it got dumped, and then later on the whole thing came out. LinkedIn was 164 million accounts, but not 164 million password hashes. LinkedIn had closer to 62 to 63 million password hashes because lots of people like to log into their LinkedIn account with Facebook and Google and other accounts that use OAuth, I believe. So they didn't have passwords to LinkedIn. Dropbox is actually, so we're going to be focusing on LinkedIn and Dropbox. Dropbox was interesting because it was dumped around the same time as these other databases, but they had already upgraded to Bcrypt. They were already using 8-cost Bcrypt. It's a plenty good enough hash for the time. It's still pretty decently strong. About half the database of the 68 million was in Bcrypt. The other half was a 40-character hex hash of some kind. It's believed to be SHA-1, but if it is, it's either got a pepper or an unknown salt that makes them impossible to crack right now. No one's ever successfully cracked any of the SHA-1 formatted hashes. The Bcrypt, however, are possible to crack. There's about 32 million of them. They're a lot harder than cracking these other databases, as you'll see. And so that's sort of where our attack kind of plays in. According to Have I Been Pwned, Troy Hunt's website, there are 300 pwned websites listed that total up to about 5.3 billion accounts. Now, clearly, there are more than 300 websites getting hacked, so 5.3 billion is probably pretty conservative. We're probably looking at, closer to 10 billion accounts floating around in dumps and underground forums and anywhere else they would show up. So we can make use of that data. LinkedIn, again, 164 million accounts, 61.8 million SHA-1 password hashes, and according to hashes.org, who hosts some of these password lists, just the hashes usually, there were 60.5 million of them cracked. So that's a 97.92 recovery rate for LinkedIn passwords. Now, SHA-1 is a very fast hash. As you'll see with the benchmark, the GTX 1080, an NVIDIA graphics card, will do about 8.5 gigahash or 8,500 mega hash per second. That is 8.5 billion hashing operations every second. So if your password is, a little stronger than most people, it's still probably in reach of someone with enough dedicated hardware and enough know-how to run a solid attack. Dropbox, on the other hand, has been around just about as long. It had 31.8 million Bcrypt hashes. Currently, only 6 million have been cracked, according to hashes.org. And that gives us an 18.98 recovery rate, much worse than the LinkedIn recovery rate. And that's because Bcrypt is so much slower and so much harder to run. This was around the same time. I bet, the passwords are roughly similar in strength and format, but running them and actually doing the cracking is just so intensive that no one has the power or the time to make it feasible. As you'll see there, the GTX 1080, same card as before, is only doing about 2,000 hashes per second. So we went from 8.5 billion hashes per second to about 2,000. That's 4.5 million times slower, which makes it 4.5 million times harder to crack this list. And they're salted, so it gets even harder, as you'll see here, with the concept of password herd immunity. When loading and cracking a large password list like LinkedIn SHA-1, if it is an unsalted list, in theory, to do the math, you still have one salt. It's null, it doesn't exist, but you have one salt that you're generating against. For each new salt in the list, you have to do all of the hashing again and again and again as you add more salts. So the workload for attacking LinkedIn SHA-1 would be, for a basic dictionary attack, it would just be the number of lines in the dictionary times 1. You only have to hash it against that one salt, and then you can just, the rest of it's comparing to all of the hashes in your list, regardless of how many. With uniquely salted lists, like large Bcrypt lists, or I believe vBulletin Forums actually has a very unique salt. It's 30 some odd characters and random. For each individual unique salt, you must do all of that hashing again for every candidate in your dictionary. For Bcrypt's 32 million salt, or Dropbox's 32 million salts, that same very basic dictionary attack just got 32 million times larger in its amount of work. So if we have the very basic RockU 10,000 password dictionary, I have 320 billion hashing operations to do for the same attack that would have taken 10,000 operations on LinkedIn. And that's on the slow hash. So we have 320 billion to do at 2,000 a second at best. So that's far from feasible. It would take years. It's just not the same. Whereas with LinkedIn SHA-1, it would take, a fraction of a second. The cost of attacking the whole list together because of these salts is what makes salting good. It's what makes it useful and makes the actual password hashes stronger, but it really only stands up in that list. And that is where the herd immunity concept sort of comes from. If you have a list with lots and lots of accounts, and each one has a unique salt, the more accounts you add, the more work it is for an attacker to crack the whole list together. Single accounts still have one salt. So if you're targeting That's not a big deal. But if you are an opportune attacker and you are trying to crack as many as possible, as fast as possible, the more salts will make it much harder. If you're a targeted attacker and you want to attack one person at a time, then you probably know a good bit about your target. You probably have 1 or 2 hashes to attack, depending on how many accounts they have, and that really plays out to like 1 or 2 salts. You probably have quite a bit of time and money to invest attacking this person. Whereas an opportune attacker, someone who steals large dumps of accounts and then uses them to just scrape as many as they possibly can out of it, and then, I don't know, crack Netflix accounts and sell them online. Someone who's doing this maliciously but isn't really dedicated on attacking any single person. These attackers are typically looking for the low-hanging fruit, the easy passwords that are heavily reused, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They don't care who it is, they just care as many accounts as they can possibly get. They're not going to spend much time on a strong account or a strong password hash because it's just not profitable for them. They only want as many as possible, as fast as possible. Any that they miss, they just throw them away. Because a large salted list is so much harder for an opportune attacker, they tend not to go for them. They tend to be, the Dropbox list has seen very little attacking. No one's really been running it because it's just so difficult. Those 6 million cracks, I believe most of them actually came from a cluster of FPGAs owned by Tycho Tithidus. He's a friend of mine. He cracked most of those over the course of, I believe, a month. It took a very long time. And that was FPGAs that were specialized for Bcrypt. So he was moving pretty quickly. With large lists of salted hashes like this, the time spent on them is just not feasible. You can't crack them classically. So the way to solve that is to remove as many passwords as you possibly can that are easy from the list to reduce that herd immunity, to try and remove as many of the salts as you possibly can. Because the more salts you remove, the more you can do to the remaining hashes. They get weaker the less there is in the list. So that's where the attack comes in. I'm calling it offline credential stuffing because it's very akin to the idea of just, correlate a password with a username, shove it into, I don't know, the Netflix login page. If it works, great, sell the account online for some Bitcoin. The classic credential stuffing, malicious activity that people do. The way this works is you have source data, databases with fast hashes, usually things like LinkedIn, where you've cracked 97% of it. You have plenty of accounts that are username or password or email and otherwise on the line, and then you have the actual plain text password. You have target data. Typically, this is databases that no one else is attacking. This could be something private to you. This could be something that you're doing for an audit. It could be anything. But these are going to be slow, uniquely salted lists, just like the Dropbox Bcrypt. The larger the list, the better this actually works, surprisingly. And what you do is you take data from the already cracked lists and you correlate it with the uncracked list, the target data. And when you do that, you take a plain text password and a slow password hash. You stick them together, and then you run just that candidate on just that hash. The reduction of workload from doing just one candidate per just one hash would bring, say you had a perfect scenario. You had 10,000 lines in your source data set and 10,000 lines that you were targeting. If you just took that source data set as a dictionary, threw it in Hashcat and said, target these 10,000 hashes, your total amount of work would be about 100 million hashes. That's a lot of work, especially because each one's uniquely salted, so you have to do that 10,000 lines against all of the 10,000 targets. If you correlate data between two data sets, a source and a target, you bring that down to maybe 2 or 3 candidates per hash at max. But in a perfect world where 10,000 lines equals 10,000 lines, you can bring that down to 1 candidate per hash, and that's per salt as well. So your total workload goes down to about 10,000 from 100 million. It brings it down incredibly. and it does so very quickly. So, and as you crack these hashes through this correlation, the ones that you miss, you can now spend more time on because there's not a whole lot in the way. They're not getting blocked up by other hashes with other salts that are causing more work. They're easier. It makes the other hashes in the list weaker. So what I did is I took LinkedIn. I took all of the cracks that I had. It actually came out to 112 million cracked lines. I believe what happened was the version of the data I got had been mixed with something else. Not sure what. And then I took the Dropbox Bcrypt. There are 32 million, but they were split into 2 files, and one of the files is a little messed up, so I skipped those. So I ended up with 24.8 million email and Bcrypt hash. And I correlated the emails in each list. And I found that in LinkedIn and in Dropbox, there are 3.5 million perfect email matches. So 3.5 million accounts exist across both LinkedIn and Dropbox. I then took all of the accounts that had cracked passwords in LinkedIn. That came out to 3.2 million. And I took those accounts, took those passwords, and put those passwords next to my Bcrypt hashes as my targets. And, as you'll see, I can crack lots and lots of Bcrypt hashes on my laptop CPU. A lot faster than you typically could be able to on GPUs, on large clusters, etc. And it'll speed up in a moment here as it catches up on its own workload. And it'll go much more quickly than I expected when I first did this. When I first did this, I thought I broke it. I thought it was just spitting it back at me. But yeah, so what this is doing is each one of these hashes is only tested against that candidate. It's only doing one operation per salt. And those candidates tend to be right because people reuse passwords like crazy. The number of people reusing their own passwords or variations thereof is surprising. And so we took a list that had 32 million. We found 3 million matching, 3.2 million that had cracked passwords that were already known. And we threw them in here, and it will very quickly, I actually know how many it will find. It will find about 2.2 million to be correct. So in minutes, not hours, days, years, on a CPU and a laptop, you can crack 2.2 million Bcrypt hashes without really doing anything. And then you have 30 million left, not 32 million hashes. So you have effectively reduced the amount of work you have to do on the rest of them. So if you take the rest of the list and then attack it classically, it's easier. You can crack more, and the more you crack, the easier it gets. So by reducing it in this way, you've made everybody else weaker. I mean, these people reuse their passwords. Maybe you didn't, but your account is now a bigger target for me. And this is cost effective for an opportune attacker. If I want to attack a whole list and I don't really care to target anybody specific, I just made it cost effective to actually keep attacking that list and doing a lot more to it than I could previously. And this is one database. My source database was LinkedIn. My target was Dropbox. If I had 5, 6, 7 billion lines of source database, I could have a match on every email in a list. And then if 70% of the people are reusing their password, I've cracked 70% of that list without doing much at all. So it's, it's not the most serious thing. It does require there to be commonalities, but it does crack a lot of passwords, and it doesn't really do a whole lot of work to do it. And it reduces the herd immunity of the rest of the list. We're going to stop that because my laptop is quite hot. Oh, I'm going to step all the way back through. Right, so again, of 24 million lines that I was targeting, I pulled 3.5 out that had commonalities with my source data, and I cracked 2.2 of those in, a couple minutes, not on the laptop, but on a beefier CPU. And that was a couple minutes of just running it straight through. This is very akin to, if you're familiar with John the Ripper, single mode, but instead of applying rules or anything else, all this does is straight run the hashes. This can be improved surprisingly well, actually. Of course, adding more source data. If you've got billions of lines, you're suddenly Troy Hunt and you want to be a bad guy, you can very easily source more and more and more data and use it, and use that data to correlate more lines, and then if more lines come with more cracks, reduce the security of the list even further. You can correlate across different columns. This actually works pretty well. I've already tried this some. That was just emails. Not everybody uses the same email everywhere. Sometimes they use the same username or the same phone number. So if you correlate across other columns in the data, depending on what data you have, you can find, collisions between lists that you maybe wouldn't have initially found. And then, of course, reduce the password list even more. You can stem emails. I actually thought about this and didn't really play with it much. I talked to Ryan C. the other day, and he said, hey, why don't we stem the emails? You could do that. And I guess I haven't really personally done this, but a lot of people, especially more technically inclined people, will use custom emails per account. So they'll have like test plus LinkedIn on their LinkedIn account. Now, Gmail or Google, they ignore everything after the plus. So that's technically the same as test at Gmail. Same with adding a bunch of periods. So in theory, those are the same email address. So you can stem emails, correlate that way, find more collisions. You can reduce the total key space. Say you have a ton of data and you've correlated accounts like crazy and now your workload's too big again. Reduce it. You can throw out site-specific passwords. Say you go through the password list and everybody's using, why does it do that? Say everybody's using, LinkedIn as part of their password, and you're trying to crack accounts on MySpace or something else. There's no reason to have LinkedIn in there. It's not going to be useful for you. They're not going to reuse LinkedIn 123 on their, Google account. You're not going to do that. So you can throw out accounts that have that problem. You can throw out candidates. You can add rules. This is something I've already explored, but it's Bcrypt. It's slow. It's not very easy. If you have a large list of candidates and you run them through and 30% of the correlated candidates crack, it's probably just because you're only doing exact identical matches. If you have someone who has password 123, maybe they're using password 1234 or 12345. So if you add rules to the individual candidates, you can still reduce the total amount of work to 5, 10, 15 candidates per hash per salt, and still reduce it massively from trying to run a normal classic attack against the list, and your recovery rates will go up. I did explore this, but again, very slow, didn't bring my rates up enough to be economical, but it does work. So yeah, there's a few ways you can make this better. Of course, more source data will always work better. If you have more source data, you'll always have more collisions, and you'll always be able to reduce the total list further. And then once you reduce the list, of course, you can run it classically. You can put it in Hashcat and just let it run. You can do whatever it is you want to do with it. So yeah, so that's the attack. I can actually make it faster if you'd like to see the demo again. If you give me a moment. I forgot a flag. So that's how fast it normally runs. Those are real-time cracks on my laptop CPU for 8 cost Bcrypt hashes. So yeah, that should actually complete in a couple minutes, I believe. It should be about 4 or 5 minutes. And it will have found 2.2 million of the 3.5 million hashes of the list. Whereas if you took this to Hashcat and took those passwords and put them in a dictionary, it would take you something close to 35 years. So nowhere near as quick as this. I'm still getting too hot, so I'm still going to stop that. Probably not a good idea to run this on a laptop. It works, it's just, So let's go all the way back here. All right, questions. Who's got a question? Do we need Mike for the question?
So you mentioned filtering the list based on site-specific passwords, but have you thought about saying, okay, this LinkedIn password is LinkedIn123. How about I change that to Dropbox123?
So that would be a little hard to do technically, from a technical standpoint, because so what you're talking about there would be stemming the passwords themselves and saying, this is site name modified by 123 and so on and so forth. Your rules are the second portion of that. They are the add 123. But the actual dictionary that you're pulling and adding to, in that case, would be pretty easy. If it's just site name, that's not a big deal. But in other cases where, maybe their password is child name whatever, and you only know one of maybe 5 children, you really can't figure out what the other password candidates would be. I have thought about that, though, yes. Technically, you can't go backward. You can stem the rule modification off, but stemming the actual source is a lot harder. Anybody else over there?
So kind of along the lines of, Dropbox versus, Facebook or something like that, what about character substitution intelligence? And did you ever look at that or see any correlation where people would use slight variations?
So what you're talking about is where if they have, just a normal password and it's slightly varied between sites? Yeah, that does come up a fair amount. If you're reusing a password and we know you're reusing it, you're very likely reusing a portion of it elsewhere as well. The problem again with that is how many modifications is too many. If I start getting, thousands of rules in, I haven't solved my problem, I've just recreated it. So the idea that you want to reduce the number of candidates really means you have to assume it's either going to be identical or very close or ignore it. And you can do that again later when you run the classic attacks, but for this, it really doesn't help too much to modify and add rules and things like that. It's better to just sweep as many as you can out now and then fall back to classic attacks. Someone over there, over here, over there?
This might be a bit of a side note, but I was just curious about the FPGAs, and you mentioned that they cracked some Bcrypt.
Sure.
What do you know? What kind of performance, like hashes per second, you could get there these days, and are there commercially available ones?
So I do know how fast the FPGAs that he was running were. They are ZTEX 1.15Y boards. They have 4 Spartan 6 chips on them. And I believe they do anywhere between 43 to 45,000 attempts per second. That was across a cluster of 15 boards, I believe. So 15 times 4 chips. Now these are older FPGAs, they're not new, they're not fancy, they don't have fast memory. Newer FPGAs could be much, much faster. The major problem is cost and getting someone to write the software for them. The 1.15Y boards, the old ZTEX boards, are supported by John the Ripper. They have Bcrypt support, DES, I believe, and a couple of SHA-256 Unix, I believe. They're just out-of-the-box supported by that tool. There are commercially available FPGA units, or ASICs or otherwise. I think the only one I can think of right now is the Tableau accelerator. It's a forensic accelerator. It works with Passware and a couple other softwares. It does not do Bcrypt, I don't believe, so I don't know how fast it would be, and it's also, again, kind of outdated. Making a new one costs a whole lot. They're not very cost effective, so most people tend not to. They could be fast. If you have the money, they could be fast.
So to any extent which you checked, were these reused passwords of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 variety, or were these some actual solid passwords?
So actually, these were solid. I was very surprised by the strength of these reused passwords. We can go ahead and, well, I'll just start it back up, and then we'll stop it and look at some of them. So if we stop it, these are decent passwords. I mean, Stephanie123, maybe not the world's strongest, but some of these are just absolute gibberish. hotdog22 is definitely a very easy password. There are definitely passwords in here, though, that I was very surprised I was cracking. Some of these, actually, most of these look pretty simple. There's a couple hard ones here and there. Again, for this list, maybe not, but there were times when I was testing this. I also tested this on the Edmodo dataset, which was a recent, very large Bcrypto's 12 cost. Very effective there. However, the passwords there tended to be site-specific. That specific website was mostly students and teachers, I believe, and most of the passwords we ran across had Edmodo in them. So instead of the source being site-specific, the target was. So the ones we were getting were very, very strong, but that was abnormal. It's because they were using a password manager, generating one, and then reusing it everywhere or something like that. That's not typical. Typically, they're a little on the easier side, but I have seen it where only the strong ones get reused because everybody else uses something so trash that it's not going to come up. I believe you had a question? Okay. Anyone else? We got one in the back.
So recognizing the ways that things can be broken, other than using absolutely random, totally different passwords that have no basis in reality, is there anything where there can be some level of reuse that isn't going to be easily cracked? Or does it have to be absolutely totally random to get what you're trying for?
So, in theory, the best option is always going to be complete randomness longer than 13 characters. Actually, roughly exactly 13 characters. You can do things to make it easier. You can do formats like Diceware, where you have 4 or 5 words that build a passphrase that's very long, very hard to attack, very hard to brute force. They're very strong Diceware passwords, and they're easy to remember is the goal. They're very easy to, 4 or 5 random words that have no correlation. Read it 4 or 5 times. You can probably recite it fast enough to type your password in. For things like that, you can have a couple words be the same and maybe change the last one, but really you shouldn't be reusing any part of passwords across websites. Websites should have unique passwords that are long and random. And that would be because you don't know if the website is hashing your password. If tomorrow the website gets breached and everything's plain text, as strong as your password was, everybody knows it. So you're trusting the site to be secure and sort of taking that, security into your own hands the best you can. Anybody else? I have no idea how much time it's been because my timer got reset, but I think we're good on time. Okay. Well, if no one has any questions, we can stream the passwords by and...
I guess like 5 minutes.
Okay, sure.
Now you mentioned that there are these lists that use strong Bcrypt where it's not easily entry level crackable by just common people. Have you heard any inference that there are some attackers that are going the long game and continuing to attack some of these more difficult patterns, or is it really something that only someone like you would really have the endeavor to go into?
So there was one list that I have seen come up time and time again that's very difficult. It's very slow hashes, and that was a Bitcoin-related forum got breached. And what they've done is, what I've seen, is mostly people that are malicious. They're looking to break into accounts. They're trying to crack these hashes. They do it on a one-by-one kind of basis. They will pick a target, pull their hash, try to crack it, and move on. So it's still not quite the massive list opportune attacker style. They're still targeting, but they are coming back to the same lists over and over and over again. And with something like this, if they could mass crack that list, it would be much more devastating because it would take them much less time to attack much more people, or many more people. So it's not happened. Most people have left Dropbox alone. That's why I picked it. Edmodo came out, and I don't think really anyone noticed. The hashes have sat untouched on the websites for a while now, but I don't think hashes.org even loaded it because it's just so difficult to crack. I mean, if you're doing it for sport, great. You can spend weeks doing it and spend a bunch of money for nothing. If you're doing it maliciously, you can't. I mean, there's not a whole lot you can do. And anyone else, I don't know why you're doing it.
And now the 8-card rigs for Hashcat, about
Yes.
how much are those if you wanted to build those retail right now, how much do those go for?
You would probably want to talk to sales at my company about that because I don't know the right number, so I'm not going to guess. I mean, if I built one, I have no idea. But yeah, no, the 8-card and 10 and however many cards there are now are great. They're just things like this where Bcrypt comes into play. You can only throw so much power at it at a time before you have to find something new. And so that's what we did.
Thank you.
Sure. Anyone else? No? Okay, we're going to watch a bunch of passwords stream by. I'll make it a little slower so it's easier to read them, but there are usually some good ones. Oh, that's not slow enough. There we go. So these are roughly the level of password that we're seeing in the Dropbox list that came from the LinkedIn list. These were all cracked in LinkedIn and then correlated over and then re-cracked in Dropbox as the Bcrypt list. Some are stronger than others. Some are quite weak. I imagine maybe some of these accounts are bots. There's a surprising amount of cross-person password reuse for passwords that don't make sense. Every now and then there will be a random password where there are 50, 100, 200 accounts with that same random password. So I have to imagine that's bots. But it does show up and it does crack pretty well. Yeah, most of these are pretty weak. I would show Edmodo, but that one is layered and has a number of issues. Edmodo chose to do 12-cost Bcrypt probably a couple years after they chose to do MD5. And to fix their database, they upgraded by just hashing MD5 with Bcrypt. So whenever you log in, your password is hashed with MD5 and then again with Bcrypt. So when they come out, you can either do that layer internally, or you can just crack them with a list of MD5 hashes. You don't even have to have the password, so that usually just looks like gibberish when I run it, because this tool will automatically parse that out for me. This tool was written by the creator of MDXFind, Waffle. I believe it was edited a little bit here and there by Hops, one of the other developers. It is custom to this, and they actually used it in the Ashley Madison talk that they gave. This is a new revised version of something they call BCVal. It's a Bcrypt validator. Right now, to slow it down, what I've done is I've had it do case twiddles. It is modifying the beginning and end character cases up and down, and it is doing 25 different variations throughout the password before skipping it and moving on. So that creates enough work that you don't see just a blur on the screen. You have a question?
Is this tool open source?
BCVal is not. I don't believe MDXFind is either. You'll have to talk to Waffle about that. But they're both, I believe both are posted. At least MDXFind is posted on hashes.org. You can find that it's pretty easy to use. It's free. It's just like Hashcat. It's chipped. There is no open source to it right now. I think he talked about it. I just don't know. Yes?
So the breaches, do that generally include the users' names associated with those assets?
So to do the correlation, you have to have the usernames. So
Can you repeat your question
Yeah.
for everybody watching it?
So do the breaches generally include the user IDs associated with these hashes?
I'm not sure I understand. Oh,
Yeah, same
well, I'm not sure I understood it the first time now because I revised it.
So like you mentioned, you have like these various breaches on the internet with hashes. Do they include the usernames associated with those hashes?
Okay.
Because otherwise you end up saying, yeah, okay, someone in the world used Pepsi 7 as a password.
Yeah.
And then what?
So typically for research and the things that I do, I strip all of that information out and I throw it away. There is some kind of gray area, kind of a legal gray area on whether or not you can have this data. It is still technically stolen data, even if it's been posted publicly. So typically the information like that, especially among the more legitimate researchers, is stripped out, thrown away, and what you are left with is just hashes or just passwords, or if you're Troy Hunt, just emails. As far as I know, he doesn't really save anything else from the databases. But you can find them. Typically, wherever the dump came from, before it got parsed by as many people as wanted to play with it and all the researchers and stuff, the original versions, or at least nearly original versions, will have all of the data in them. And you'll have emails, usernames, IDs, phone numbers, anything that got dumped.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Looking at the list of the passwords that's scrolling across, I see clumps of very similar passwords. Can you explain?
So that's artifact of when I cracked the LinkedIn list. These passwords, as they appear in the correlation list, are sorted by that column, not the hashes. And it was sorted in the order that they cracked in Hashcat. So I cracked the SHA-1 from LinkedIn, and then left it in that format, and then correlated across using the hash plane and the email hash, and then the email hash from Dropbox. So what you're seeing is a little bit of leftover clumping because that's how Hashcat broke them the first time, and now these hashes are being broken by those same passwords in the same order. It is interesting, though. I probably wouldn't have noticed that. Yes? Over here.
So obviously I'm seeing that a lot of the passwords are a lot shorter.
Yes.
And one of the passwords I saw scrolling by that caught my attention was just the Pikachu. And I was thinking that if that wasn't in the dictionary used as a word, that it might as well just be a random array of characters. And obviously it's still short to be a strong password. But would you say that something like that is generally better than like obviously just a straight normal English dictionary word followed by numbers?
So in theory, if you have a rare word, however you might come about classifying a word as rare, a normal dictionary attack, and maybe even dictionary attacks with rules, won't find them. If they're short, it doesn't matter though, because then you fall under mask and brute force and everything else. The other thing is, sometimes words look a little more random or a little more rare than they are statistically. There are many attacks, like some of the cut attacks, where you take two halves of the same word, split them on the whole list, and then start shifting that list. You'll find words that are valid that you would never have thought of. So there's attacks that may find it here and there. Of course, if for some reason your word is a word, it's probably in a dictionary, but again, if it's not, then yes, you should avoid most of the attacks that'll attack your password.
All right, thank you.
Over here, over there.
So you mentioned that one of the lists was not able to be cracked because there's a pepper in it.
Yes.
Based on your experience, going through all these passwords and how they break down, do you think that generally, in your personal opinion, that developers should, even if in theory it's not very imposing, they should have a hard-coded pepper in their code that maybe won't be dumped in a database dump?
I don't personally believe in hard-coded, because if I'm an attacker and I've broken in enough to steal your database, I've probably broken enough to steal the pepper.
Do you see that in? I guess maybe that might be outside of your range. Do you see that in practice?
So I have seen a few actually databases where a hard-coded salt or pepper was used, and in almost all of them, it was either short enough that we eventually broke it, or it was found by the hackers and then dumped with the database.
And now, can you speak of how you found the pepper?
I think we're a little out of time,
Okay.
but I'll talk to you outside about it. And yeah, they're typically pretty easy to find, and the dumpers have found them for us.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. So I think that's it.